Okay, let's talk. So I can already hear some of you screaming that my measurements were wrong in the last video. And you're right. There could be a discrepancy of anywhere between probably around half an inch to almost up to an inch, depending on where the measurement lies on your arm. Because of the design of the arm guard that I'm going for, the error is going to be lost in the backside of the arm guard because it doesn't fully enclose the arm. And so by not completely closing on the arm, any error just gets into that main gap that I've already built into the design. So if you're satisfied with that explanation, you can kind of just move on and just accept that. If you'd like to know why the measurements are not accurate and what you would do if you needed something to completely fully enclose the arm, then keep watching. If you remember, the way that I measured my arm was I took a piece of string and I just simply wrapped it around my arm, and wherever the string overlapped, that was what I measured to. I came to 11.5 inches. To demonstrate why this is incorrect, let's start with a circle. This circle represents the cross section of my arm, okay? My arm. The string that I wrapped around my arm, that'll be represented by this small circle around. And right where that string overlaps, that's where I made my measurement. So the length of this string is the circumference of this circle, which is 11.5 inches. The reason this doesn't work when you want a piece of leather that doesn't overlap and doesn't come short, we didn't take into account the thickness of the leather. So if you imagine a piece of leather that's some arbitrary thickness, and that's going to be this next circle. This is a terrible drawing, but you get the idea. The inner circle being my arm, the second middle circle, that's going to be the bottom surface of the leather that's up against my arm, right? The outer circle is going to be the surface of the leather, however thick it may be. Thin, thick, doesn't matter, it has a thickness. The outer circle, because it has a greater distance from the center of my arm, it's a larger circle. So the circumference of that circle is longer than the circumference of the inner circle. The thickness of the leather will dictate a longer length of leather that then has to go around my arm. So 11.5 inches represents not the exact size of the leather, it actually represents the minimum size of the leather. It will be larger than that. The easiest thing to do, and the most accurate thing to do, if you have it, is to just take a piece of scrap leather and do the exact same thing as we did with the string. Just wrap it around your arm, and wherever it overlaps, mark it, measure it, you're good. But if you don't have a piece of scrap leather, you don't necessarily want to cut a new piece of scrap leather that you're just gonna have as waste, I suppose. We don't want to create waste where we don't need to. So how do you figure out what length it should be without first having to waste your leather? Math. We know the circumference of this inner circle is 11.5 inches. I'm going to write that in again. Okay? What we don't know is the radius of a circle with that circumference, but we can solve for that mathematically. And we also know the length, the width of this leather, which I'm going to say, for example, is about 8 ounces. So we'll say this is 8 ounce leather. Okay? First thing we're going to do is convert ounces to inches. Now, again, the easy thing to do is to go to your leather, take some calipers or a very accurate ruler and just measure the thickness. But let's say it's on order and you don't even have the leather in stock yet, you're waiting for it to ship. You need to have an idea of the thickness of this leather. A good rule of thumb that's worked for me every time I've tried it, so if it doesn't work for you, let me know, because I'd love to hear about that, is 1 ounce of leather seems to correspond roughly to 1/64th of an inch of leather. So 8 ounces becomes 8/64ths of an inch, which to simplify is 1/8 of an inch. So now we know the thickness of our leather, as a rule of thumb, is going to be 1/8 of an inch, given 8 ounce leather. The next thing we need to do is solve for the radius of the inner circle, the minimum circle of leather. Once we know that, we can get to work. The formula for a circle, the circumference is 2 pi r. So we're going to solve for radius equals 11.5 inches divided by 2 pi. Okay? This equals 1.83 inches. We know that the inner circle radius is 1.83 inches. The outer circle radius is simply 1.83 inches plus 1/8 of an inch. That's the thickness of our leather. Now, to get the length of the maximum distance the leather may travel, we just solve again for the circumference of the outer piece, which is 1.955 times 2 pi, 12.285 inches, or we'll just call that 12 1/4. You might be tempted to call it a day and say this is the exact size of the leather that you need. That's not quite accurate. There's a few variables at play. The most significant is my arm is not a circle. I don't think anybody's arm is going to be a perfect circle. So by converting this length, this measurement into a circle, we've lost some accuracy, which means that our end result is not going to be fully precise either. What you can say is that your length is going to be somewhere between the minimum and the maximum. It should not exceed the maximum. So we know that the length of this leather is going to be between 11.5 and 12.25 inches. So at this point, what I would do is a rough cut of 12.25 inches, and then I would go back to the tried and true method of wrapping it around. Once I actually get it, I'd cut off the 12.25, and your width should be, your loss should be really minimal at that point, because you've accounted for the maximum size. You know you don't need to go any larger than that, so your waste is going to be pretty minimal at that point. That's how I would do it if I was looking to make my leather perfectly butt up together after going around, say, a cylinder, my arm, or what have you. But it doesn't really matter in our case because we're going to stop short. And any error that's in there, yeah, there is some, but it's going to so maybe it'll be a slightly wider gap than I planned, but it's not going to look bad. And alternatively, if you were planning to overlap the leather so that one side goes under the other, again, you don't really care. You care a lot about this maximum number, but it doesn't have to be that precise. So anyway, that's the summary of what we could have done, but didn't really matter for what we're trying to accomplish here. I hope that clarifies some things.